In this video, I'm going to talk about how we describe the electron configuration when we are using the principles of the quantum mechanical model, which is our current understanding of how atoms are put together. First of all, just a quick review. Remember that atoms are built from three subatomic particles, protons, neutrons, and electrons. And all atoms of any particular element are going to have the same number of protons because protons are going to determine the identity of the atom. The number of neutrons will differ or can differ in a particular element, and that forms isotopes. So we have carbon-12 and carbon-13 and carbon-14, all different isotopes of carbon. The numbers there refer to the mass, which is calculated by adding together protons and neutrons. And then the number of electrons can also differ, and in that case you form ions of a particular element, and it can be positive or negative depending upon how the number of electrons compares to the number of protons. So if you have more protons than electrons, you have a positive ion. More electrons than protons, you have a negative ion. Now you have done some illustrations of models using of atoms using the Bohr model. And if you remember, in the Bohr model, we indicate the protons and neutrons in the nucleus, often writing the number of protons and neutrons in the center of the model. And then electrons are arranged in distinct energy levels or orbits surrounding that nucleus, and the rows in the periodic table tell you how many orbits you have, how many energy levels you have in a Bohr model. So here for bromine, our little illustration, we have bromine is found in the fourth row on the periodic table, and so we have 4 circles around that nucleus showing 4 energy level that can hold electrons. The Bohr model was very useful in helping us understand that electrons can move between energy levels. They can jump up to a higher energy level when the electrons have been excited by adding heat or adding light energy. And then those electrons will not stay in that higher energy level. They will eventually drop back down. And as they come back down, they give off light. They emit light, and the light will come in different colors depending upon how far that electron is jumping, how many levels it is changing. And we looked at some color that's produced in when we did the flame lab experiment. And so anytime we have light being produced, energy or electrons are being energized in some way or the other. Another important part of the Bohr model is that each energy level can only hold a certain number of electrons. So with our example here with bromine, you can see our first energy level only has 2 electrons, whereas the second energy level has 8. So now we're going to move on to the quantum mechanical model, which is our current understanding of how atoms are put together. And in the quantum mechanical model, electrons are found in orbitals, not orbits. And orbitals are really a cloud of electron possibilities. So the understanding is that we can't really predict where we're going to find an electron. We can just predict where we probably will find it if we are going to look for it. The different orbitals also have the different energy levels, like we saw with the orbits that you drew for the Bohr model. So looking at the periodic table and looking at the rows is still the process you will use in quantum mechanical quantum mechanical models for determining electron configuration. But what's unique about these orbitals is they have different shapes. So they're not all circular pathways around a nucleus. There are 2 orbitals being illustrated here, the s orbital having more of a circular spherical shape, whereas the p orbital kind of has 2 lobes that are connected to, often this is called a dumbbell shape. So these orbitals that electrons live in, they're not orbits, they're orbitals. There are orbitals that are every orbital, no matter where it is found, will only hold 2 electrons. And these orbitals are arranged in the different energy levels in sublevels. And we identify the sublevel by a letter. So we have 4 letters, S, P, D, and F. We're mainly going to be concerned with S, P, and D in this chemistry course. Each of these orbitals in the different sublevels have different shapes. So as I already mentioned, the s sublevel orbitals are spherical in shape. They're like a ball. And each energy level only has 1 s orbital. So there's a 1s orbital on the first energy level. There's another s orbital on the second energy level. There's a s orbital on the third energy level, but there's only 1 of them. The p sublevel has these two lobes. As I said, some people say they look like a dumbbell, and each energy level can hold 3 p orbitals. Now the first energy level just has s, but the second energy level and above have s and p. So in the second energy level, you can have an s orbital and then a p, or s sublevel orbital, and then a p sublevel orbital. And between the two of them, you'll end up with 8 electrons, because there'll be 2 electrons in the s, and then there'll be 2 in each of these 3 p orbitals, giving you 6 electrons in your p sublevel. Then moving on to the D's and F, we get larger and more complicated. So 5 orbitals in the D sublevel, 7 orbitals in the F sublevel, and they form much more complex shapes than spheres and dumbbells. These pictures try to give you an idea about how electrons are arranged. So we have our s orbitals in the spherical shape, our p orbitals in dumbbell shapes oriented in the x, y, z planes, because of course electrons are negatively charged particles and negative charges repel. So electrons want to stay as far as possible away from each other, even when they're all around the same atom, and so they will arrange themselves in these electron clouds in directions that kind of keep them away from everybody else. And you can see our d sublevel orbitals have some kind of ordinary shapes here, until this crazy one on the end was sort of a donut in the middle between 2 lobes. The F gets even more complicated. I didn't include those pictures. So this is how we are, by calculations really, not by seeing with our eyes, but by calculations, we're determining these are how electrons, the space that electrons exist in. Each one of these orbitals, remember, can hold 2 electrons, so just 2 electrons in this s orbital, 2 electrons across this p orbital, and 2 electrons in even these 4-lobed d orbitals. So they're not like there's 4 places for electrons, it's just 4 probable locations, but there's still only 2 electrons. Electrons, for the quantum mechanical model, as in the Bohr model, is that you want them they will naturally be in their lowest possible energy level. As long as they're not excited, they're going to be the closest possible distance to the nucleus, because it takes more energy to stay farther away. And as I already mentioned, the s sublevel holds 2 electrons, the p holds 6, and the d holds 10, and if we got on to f, there'd be 14 electrons potentially there. When an atom is put together, we don't really build them one proton, they are not built 1 proton and 1 electron at a time, but the lower energies are always filled first. But what gets tricky is that as we get into these higher sublevels, there are areas where they overlap, especially when it concerns the D's and the S's, the d orbitals and the s orbital, and then we get to the f orbital and the d orbitals. So you can see in this diagram, which is showing us how energy is changing from low to high with these different energy levels, first, second, third, and fourth. Here, when we got a 3D sublevel, it is actually at a higher energy level, it's higher up the graph, than the 4s. So electrons that are in the 4s orbital sublevel actually have a lower energy level than the ones that are in the 3D. Thankfully, there's a very convenient way to use your periodic table to keep track of where electrons, which orbital they are in, and that makes all of this a whole lot easier to deal with than you might be thinking at the moment. So as I just suggested, we'll be able to use our periodic table to determine the orbitals that electrons are found in for any element. Just like in the Bohr model, each row or each period will represent a different energy level, so you have a possibility of 7 different energy levels. But the columns are representing the sublevels. So if we move our helium, which is found on the right, all the way over here next to hydrogen, these first 2 columns contain electrons that are found in the s block of those particular energy levels. So these are the 1s orbitals, or the 2s orbitals, or the 3s orbital. Over here on the far right, these 6 columns all make up the p block. So electrons here are in the p sublevel orbitals. And then the transition elements that are in the middle are in the d sublevel orbitals. The ones way down on the bottom that we're really not going to deal with very often are where you find the f sublevel orbitals. And so our periodic table, arranged long before we understood about the quantum mechanics, very conveniently helps us write these electron configurations, because electrons are all about how atoms react with each other. And so when atoms are reacting with the same patterns, they get put together in the same columns. And now we're understanding it's because of how the electrons are arranged around the nucleus that determines how they react. So this all is fitting together very nicely, even though the periodic table was developed long before we understood what was going on inside an atom. So to determine the electron configuration, you're going to count each electron in the sections until you reach that atom, just like you were doing with a Bohr model when you were counting how many blocks you went through before you got to your atom. And then you would record those electrons in a particular format. There's 3 parts. You would write your primary energy level, which is the 1 through 7, followed by the sub-level letter, the S, P, D, or F, and then the number of electrons that are found in that sub-level as a superscript. That means as a small number up in the air. You will notice on this periodic table as well, those different sublevels have been indicated with little labels. So this says here's 1s, and then we've got 2s, and over here we see 2p, and they give you arrows to show you that 2p covers the electrons that are in all of these blocks. And then we have our d orbitals and our f orbitals. And so you can add this information to your periodic table if you want to indicate where the orbitals are found to help you instead of having to refer back to this video. So let's write a electron configuration. We'll pick a familiar atom. Let's pick oxygen. So we have our atomic number 8, oxygen, over here in the middle of the P block. You see it's in the row that's labeled 2P. And so we're going to count all of the electrons that will get us up to oxygen. So we start in the first energy level. So it's going to have electrons in the 1s orbital level, and we've got 2 there because we're counting our way to oxygen, so we're going all the way through the first row. So we would say 1s2, 2 electrons in the 1s orbital. Then we move down to the second row, and we've got again 2 electrons in the s orbital for that energy level, so it'd be 2s2. And then we're going to jump over to our p orbital level, and so in the p sublevel we have 4 electrons, and so we would write 2p4. So the electron configuration for oxygen is 1s2, 2s2, 2p4, and that's how you would say it. You wouldn't indicate when you were talking about it whether you were talking about the superscripts or not. So you're just sort of counting your way across and filling in the correct number of electrons based on whether you're in the s columns or the p columns or the d columns. Now with these transition metals that have d orbitals, it does get a little trickier because those d orbitals are at a lower energy level. They are 1 energy level below the row number. So you can see here on row 4, where we got 4s electrons starting it off, in the middle here it says 3d. So the electrons in these transition metals of that first row across are in the 3d sublevel, not anything with 4, even though we're in the 4th row. So you would do the electron configuration the same way. Just remember that when you're getting to this middle part, you are working in 3D. And then when you write the energy levels, you're actually going to write them in order, even though if we're doing sequentially from left to right, we're talking about 4s before 3D. You would write it 3D before 4s. So to just use an example, let's take iron here in the middle. So iron, atomic number 26. So the electron configuration for iron, well, we have to write all of the electrons to get to the 4th energy level. So what do we have? Well, in the first energy level, we've got a 1s2. The second energy level, we have a 2s2 electrons, and then a 2p6. That takes care of our electrons all the way over here till we go off the table. Third row, we've got our 3s2, 3p6, and then we know we have some 3d electrons, but we're not sure what those are yet because we haven't counted them. So we're going to just sort of put that there as a placeholder, count our 2 4s electrons, and then figure out how many d electrons do we have. Well, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have 6 electrons in the d level, so it's 3d6. So the electron configuration for iron is 1s2, 2s2, 2p6, 3s2, 3p6, 3d6, 4s2. Now you can see that electron configurations get quite lengthy, and especially as you move further down the periodic table. So there is a shortcut method, which is known as the noble gas notation method. And to do that, you take the closest noble gas, and that is this last column on the periodic table. So again, if we were doing something like iron, we would go to the row above. So the closest noble gas would be argon over here from the 3rd energy level. And so you would start to write your configuration. You write that atomic symbol in square brackets and then add the electrons that it takes to reach that particular atom. So you're basically saying this atom is just like the noble gas, but it has these few extra electrons. So I mentioned iron, let's do somebody else. So let's do copper. So here's copper. So copper is also in that same row, so we'd be going back. So copper is just like argon, so we'd put argon here in square brackets. And then what does it have that argon doesn't have? Well, it's going to have some 3d electrons, and it's going to have these 4s electrons. So we've got our 3d and our 4s. We already know it's 4s2 because we go all the way through it. And then d, we have to count our way across, and you'll see we have 3d9. So the electron configuration using the noble gas notation method for copper is argon 3d9 4s2. So that really shortens things down, especially if you get to these larger atoms at the bottom of the periodic table. Another way that we sometimes talk about the electrons in an atom is to do an orbital filling diagram. And so we're thinking about how they fill up the sublevel. Each orbital in the sublevel, remember, can hold 2 electrons, and atoms put 1 electron into each orbital all the way across the sublevel before they start filling up that orbital, before they start doubling up. Because remember, electrons have a negative charge. They want to be as far away from each other as possible. So you can see that down here with oxygen again. We'd already figured out our electron configuration was 1s2, 2s2, 2p4. So in orbital filling diagrams, you have these little blocks where you'll put arrows in representing the electrons. So the 1s block has 2 electrons in it. The 2s block has 2 electrons in it. And then the 2p block has 4. And it's arranged so that you have 1 electron in each block, 1, 2, 3, and then that 4th electron goes back and doubles up. Because the electrons want to be spread as far apart as possible. They don't want to all be piled up next to each other. So you noticed I had the arrows when I'm drawing the electrons in the orbital filling diagrams, and this is indicating how the electrons are spinning. Electrons evidently are unique in that they rotate on an axis just like the Earth rotates, and within an orbital, one is rotating clockwise and the other electron is rotating counterclockwise. So the electrons are spinning in opposite directions, and those spinning electrons create magnetic fields. If the orbital is full with 2 electrons, basically the 2 magnetic fields would cancel each other out. But if you have a lot of orbitals with only a single electron in them, then you have a greater chance of having a magnetic element. And if you remember, the iron had a 3d6, so there are 5 d orbitals, and 4 of them would only have a single electron in them spinning away. So that's one of the reasons that iron is a magnetic element. That's something that's really much more advanced than what we have to deal with chemistry class, but I thought I would just drop in that little bit of information. It's the kind of thing you tend to talk about in physics more than chemistry. So as we've been moving through chemistry, we've seen a change, this idea that the atom had a nucleus with electrons going around it any which way was sort of the first way that atoms were conceptualized. And then we talked about the Bohr model and how they were put in orbits around that central nucleus. And now we are down to this idea that the electrons are actually in orbitals and they are arranged around the nucleus, something like we see here, where you have s orbitals and p orbitals, and the electrons are taking probable paths, kind of in interesting directions, that allow these atoms then to react the way they do. When it comes to reaction, the only ones we're really concerned about are the ones that are far away from the nucleus. So in this illustration over here, it's these 3s orbital electrons are the ones that are going to react in magnesium. These are all sort of models of magnesium. And that's the next topic that you're going to read about in the assignment on the valence electrons. We'll be dealing with them quite a bit more when we do molecular structure. So this gives you an overview of electron configuration using the quantum mechanical model, and you'll have some time to practice this in the class to help solidify this understanding.